In the late summer of 1864, the people of Harrow's Gate fell asleep and never woke up. That was the first line written in a faded county report, dated August 26th, and it has haunted every archivist who has read it since. They say the discovery was almost accidental. A pair of traders from the next valley came to Harrow's Gate with a wagon of salt pork and flour. What they found wasn't silence, it was stillness. Every window stood open, every door ajar, and in every house, every barn, every narrow dirt road. The people of Harrow's Gate were asleep. Men still clutching plow handles, their boots sunk in damp soil. Women at tables, spoons paused mid-stir in cold pots of stew. A boy, face pressed to a chalkboard, as though he had drifted off mid-word. Nothing could wake them. Neighbors shook shoulders, rang bells, shouted until their throats turned raw. A lantern overturned and set an empty barn ablaze. Yet no one stirred. And in the mayor's office, there was one more unsettling detail. A heavy leather ledger, its binding cracked with age. In the middle of its entries, there was a single page torn out, leaving behind faint indentations of whatever had once been written there. The page was never found. Some say the town still sleeps beneath the soil, its people dreaming in the dark. Others wonder if Harrow's Gate ever truly woke up. Harrow's Gate was not the kind of place meant to be remembered. By the summer of 1864, it barely registered as more than a faint smudge on the county maps, a small square mark pressed between swampland to the south and a stretch of dense, pine-choked forest to the north. Travelers said you could pass through it in 10 minutes and still feel as though you had somehow missed it. The land itself seemed to keep its own secrets. The soil was dark, almost black, heavy with the scent of wet earth and iron. After rain, the roads turned slick and clinging, pulling at wagon wheels like hungry hands. In spring, wild violets bloomed in the ditches, their purple petals slick with dew, but by midsummer the flowers wilted and the air thickened into something weighty, a humid stillness that pressed against the skin. Old surveyor notes from decades earlier marked this patch of earth with a single Latin word: somnus, sleep. No explanation, no translation, just that one word written in the faded ink of an unsteady hand. There was a main road, if you could call it that, a dirt track lined with leaning fence posts. It led into the heart of Harrow's Gate, where the clock tower stood, narrow and listing slightly to one side, its iron bell rusted but intact. Even in its prime, locals said, it rarely rang. The creek to the west ran sluggish and low, its water tinted the color of weak tea, carrying the smell of moss and something older, something that clung to the banks like a breath. Crossing its weathered wooden bridge meant stepping into the town's quiet, like stepping into a sealed room. The town was a scatter of structures, a one-room schoolhouse with a slate roof chipped at the edges, a narrow church whose steeple had been struck by lightning years before, and a row of modest clapboard houses with sagging porches and unpainted shutters. At night, a single oil lamp lit outside the sheriff's office was said to be the only steady glow in the dark. But what was most striking was not what the town had. It was what it didn't. There were no cemeteries, no marked graves, no small fenced plots behind houses the way most rural towns kept. Some said it was because Harrow's Gate was too young for death to find it. Others whispered it was something more deliberate, an absence so careful it almost felt like a design. The sounds of Harrow's Gate, before the sleep came, were sparse but distinct. The creak of wagon wheels, the uneven toll of that leaning clock tower, the occasional bark of a distant dog carried over from a farmhouse. And yet, Visitors often described the air as heavy, as if even the sounds didn't travel far here. And there was another oddity, barely mentioned in county ledgers. No one stayed long. Peddlers, school inspectors, circuit preachers, they all wrote of Harrow's Gate as a place they passed through, never as a place they lingered. One traveler noted something peculiar in his journal in 1863, the year before the event. He wrote simply, "The tower's clock reads 2:17. It has read 2:17 every time I've passed this way, for 5 years." The town lived by that frozen clock, unaware, perhaps, that time had already stopped counting for them. When neighbors from the next valley entered Harrow's Gate that August morning, they said the clock still read 2:17. It hasn't moved since. Every town leaves traces of the people who built it. Harrow's Gate, in its way, left a trail of names, written in fading ink across ledgers, stitched into the corners of school books, carved into the backs of chairs. They tell us who lived there, and in some ways, who stayed behind. The mayor, Edwin Thatch, was the first name that surfaces in the county archives. A man of exacting habits, he kept meticulous weather logs, notes on rainfall, frost, and wind direction, as though the sky itself were a ledger he meant to balance. His last entry, dated August 23, 1864, is neat and deliberate. Cloud cover at dawn. Air unnaturally still. No birds this morning. After that, the journal ends. The preacher, Silas Gray, arrived in Harrow's Gate just 3 years earlier. His sermons, according to surviving notes, were fiery at first. Brimstone and repentance from the small wooden pulpit of the church. But by the spring of '64, they changed. Witnesses wrote they became hushed, almost fearful, his handwriting slanting downward in the pages of his personal journal. The final words in that book trail off mid-line. "And if we sleep, we—" The sentence was never finished. There was Sheriff Martha Weller, the only woman to hold such a position in the region at the time. Records say she kept the town orderly and was known for walking the main road each evening with a lantern. Her logbook, found on her desk months after the event, stops suddenly on a single line. The air feels heavier at night. Folks moving slower. More complaints of bad dreams. And then there was Lillian Pike, the school teacher. Barely 23, she wrote letters home on pressed paper, describing the children's lessons, their handwriting, their songs. Her final letter, never sent, ended abruptly. "And tomorrow, the children shall—" The ink cuts off there, the rest of the page blank. These are only fragments, but even fragments reveal a pattern. Letters to neighboring towns mention unsettling dreams of farmers waking drenched in sweat, unable to recall what they had seen in sleep. A merchant complained that his customers had begun to pause mid-transaction, staring into nothing, as if they'd forgotten where they stood. What's strange is how orderly everything seemed, right up until it wasn't. The townsfolk still planted their crops, still attended church, still wrote their ledgers and journals, right up to the last line. And then, nothing. Sheriff Weller's lantern was found later, sitting on her porch steps. The glass still clean, the wick still trimmed, as if it had been set down gently, just before the town drifted into silence. But it's the preacher's journal that unsettles the most. That single broken sentence, "And if we sleep, we," is like a door left half open, waiting for someone to push it wider. No one in Harrow's Gate ever finished their last thought. Every diary, every sermon, every ledger entry stops mid-breath, as if the entire town paused in the same instant. Long before that August morning in 1864, Harrow's gate was already slowing down. It began with things so small, they barely made the margins of memory. The fog, for one. In most towns, fog comes with dawn, a pale mist that burns away by mid-morning. But in Harrow's gate, it began to appear at noon. The records from a passing peddler note. At midday, the road vanished. The fog came low, so thick it seemed to press down from the sky. Then there were the animals. By spring, the livestock grew restless. Horses refused to cross the wooden bridge over the creek. Cows were found standing motionless in fields, eyes half-lidded, as if drifting somewhere far beyond the pasture. A farmer's logbook mentions his dog, an aging collie, staring at the church steeple one evening and howling for nearly an hour. And still, people stayed. Because that's what people do. They explain things away. But the explanations began to crack. In June, tools started disappearing. Not valuables, not gold or guns, just tools. A blacksmith wrote that his tongs were missing, then his hammer, then an entire barrel of nails. A shop ledger from that same month lists odd shortages: rope, lantern oil, seed sacks, and then one note scrawled hastily in the margin: "Who keeps taking the clocks?" By July, the hum began. Several accounts describe it: a faint vibration in the air, not quite sound, not quite silence. The preacher called it a low hymn without words. Children drew circles in the dirt, saying they could hear it best when they put their ears to the ground. One letter, found years later in the attic of a farmhouse, describes waking to that sound in the dead of night. It was like the earth was breathing beneath the floorboards. By mid-August, sleep itself was changing. Neighbors began speaking of unusual dreams, heavy, fevered dreams they could barely recall upon waking. A visiting circuit rider wrote in his journal that when he stayed one night in Harrow's gate, he woke feeling as though I'd been buried in a dream that wasn't mine. And there was another note, the last before silence fell. On the night of August 23, 1864, a letter left Harrow's gate. It was never sent, found later in the postmaster's locked drawer. The ink still damp when discovered, the words shaky, uneven. The fog is back again, but now it comes with the sound. The children won't wake easy. By dawn, that letter's author would be asleep like all the rest, and Harrow's gate would never wake again. There is no single account of the moment it happened. No one who lived in Harrow's gate on August 24, 1864, ever wrote another word. What we have instead are fragments, letters from neighboring towns, a sheriff's log that stopped the day before, and the whispers of travelers who claimed they saw the edges of what came. The night before the event, the weather turned strange. There was no storm, but the sky darkened all the same, a rolling bruise of clouds that carried no thunder, no rain. The sheriff's last note, written just hours before her pen stopped moving, read, "The air feels heavy, as though waiting." People later said the fog returned that evening, thicker than before, crawling low across the ground like water, slipping under doors and through broken window frames. Neighbors from the next valley, watching from the ridges, described an unnatural stillness settling over Harrow's gate as night fell. Not the quiet of sleep, but something closer to held breath. When the traders arrived at first light, they found the town silent. Not dead, not abandoned. Silent. Every soul in Harrow's gate, all 241 residents, lay asleep. Some had collapsed where they stood. A man halfway up a ladder, paintbrush still in hand. A woman frozen mid-step in the dusty main road, shawl slipping from her shoulders. A little boy face down in the schoolroom, chalk dust smudged on his cheek. Others had simply stopped. Sitting in chairs, standing in doorways, leaning against walls as though sleep had taken them mid-breath. Neighbors shook them, shouted, even poured buckets of water over their heads. Nothing worked. One story, impossible to verify, but repeated in several county reports, tells of a barn catching fire when a lantern was kicked over. The flames consumed half the roof. Still, no one stirred. By noon, word had spread. Doctors arrived first, then clergymen, then soldiers. They tried everything, smelling salts, cold river water, the jarring crack of musket fire. Nothing woke them. By nightfall, fear spread faster than the fog. The visitors began to leave. One soldier's diary entry, written before he deserted his post that evening, says simply, "It feels wrong to stay, like the sleep might be catching." The strangest thing wasn't that they slept. It was how they slept. Every face was calm. No sign of pain, no thrashing or twitching, just the faintest movement of breath, as if the whole town were dreaming together. And in the mayor's office, under a cracked window, they found the ledger, the same one with the missing page. The rest of the book was filled with neat, steady entries, inventories, tax notes, weather marks, until, abruptly, there was a tear. One page ripped clean, the faint indentations of words still pressed into the paper beneath it. The missing page was never found. By sunset, even the searchers wouldn't stay the night. They locked the doors of Harrow's gate behind them, leaving the sleepers exactly where they lay. The morning after the discovery, the town of Harrow's Gate no longer belonged to its people. It belonged to the outsiders, doctors, clergymen, and eventually soldiers, all trying to solve what couldn't be solved. They arrived in wagons and on horseback, armed with medical kits, holy water, and fear they wouldn't admit out loud. They examined the bodies, not corpses, not quite, and made lists. They wrote about their breathing, steady, shallow, about their skin, warm to the touch, as if merely napping, about their hearts, slow but beating. One doctor from the county seat performed something like an autopsy on a sleeping farmhand, cutting lightly into the man's arm, then stitching it shut again when he bled. The sleeper never stirred. The clergy tried next. Prayers were whispered over them, then shouted. Crosses were pressed to their foreheads. Incense burned until the church rafters turned black. Nothing. By the second week, decay began. Not of the people. Their bodies remained strangely preserved. But the town itself started to rot. Milk curdled in pans, bread hardened to stone. Livestock, left unattended, wandered off into the woods or starved in their pens. And yet the sleepers lay there, untouched by time. Their faces calm, their breaths the only sound in rooms that smelled of mold and soot. One object, however, resisted even the smallest trace of damage: the ledger. The same thick-bound book found in the mayor's office. When soldiers returned weeks later, its pages were spotted with dust, its cover darkened by soot, but the torn page remained gone. Only the faint indentations remained. Years later, an archivist examined the marks under lamplight, brushing graphite over the pressed fibers. Slowly, ghostly letters began to emerge. One word took shape, carved deep into the paper by the missing pen stroke. Somnus, Latin for sleep. Neighbors, unwilling to go near the town, spoke of odd movements in the weeks that followed. A curtain swaying in an abandoned house, a door closing when no wind blew. One farmer's daughter swore she saw a figure standing at the schoolhouse window in broad daylight, as still as a picture. And then there was the doll. It turned up 11 miles away, in a ditch beside the road. A small cloth doll, its face rubbed with ash, one eye missing. It was identified by the Pike family, who had lost their daughter to sleep. They never came to claim it. In the end, the soldiers left. The doctors stopped coming. The clergy stopped praying. The town was sealed, doors nailed shut, shutters barred, but the sleepers were never buried. It was as if no one dared move them. The ledger stayed behind, a single word pressed into its page like a warning, and Harrow's gate kept breathing, softly, endlessly, as though it dreamed. In time, Harrow's gate disappeared. Not in an instant, not with fire or flood, but in the quiet way places fade when no one dares to speak their name. By the 1870s, maps had been redrawn. Where Harrow's gate once stood, there was only a blank patch of pale parchment, the roads sketched to curve around it, as if the land itself had swallowed a piece of its own memory. New settlers came to the county, but none built near the ruins. Farmers would guide their plows wide, giving the place a wide berth. Travelers swore their horses balked when the trail bent too close to where the old clock tower leaned. And yet, pieces of the town endured. The stone foundations of houses, moss-covered and half-buried in weeds, the church steps, cracked and slanted, leading nowhere. And above it all, the clock tower, leaning further now, the wood eaten by rain, but its face still there, still frozen, the hands locked stubbornly at 217. Those who did venture near claimed the land felt wrong beneath their feet, soft in places, as though something shifted just below the soil. One ranch hand told his employer he heard breathing in the empty fields. He left the next day, abandoning his pay. Some tried to explain what had happened: a sickness, a poison, a curse whispered by the superstitious. But explanations only go so far when the facts refuse to fit. Because no one, not a doctor, not a priest, not even the soldiers who came armed with rifles and fear, could answer the only question that mattered. Why did they never wake? And if Harrow's gate still breathes beneath the soil, what dream has held it there for more than a century? Harrow's gate is not on the map. Ask anyone in the county where it stood, and you'll hear conflicting stories. An empty patch of farmland, a tangle of pine forest, a name they think they might have heard once long ago. But if you walk far enough and you listen closely enough, you'll still find pieces of it. The stone outlines of homes, the warped wood of the schoolhouse floorboards, the clock tower slumped to one side, its hands frozen at 217, as if time itself refused to move past that hour. And somewhere, in the archives of a nearby town, the ledger sits under glass. The page is still missing. But under lamplight, if you tilt it just right, the ghost of a word appears in the fibers. Somnus. Sleep. What was written on that page? Was it a warning? A prayer? Or something else entirely? Something that was never meant to be read aloud? The people of Harrow's Gate fell asleep in the summer of 1864, and they have never woken. Maybe they never will. Or maybe, just maybe, they are still dreaming, waiting for someone or something to wake them. And if that day comes, what else might rise with them?